Can the Ducks pull off a repeat Big Ten championship in 2025? And yes, I'm talking about these Ducks and not these Ducks, but it's good to be diverse. And I originally did this video a little bit differently. I wanted to go kind of in depth with the transfers and recruits, talk about Decoria Moore, talk about Hughes coming in, talking about what Dante Moore could do as a quarterback. And I think it's good to have all that information coming into the conversation. But I really want to just approach it as a Ducks fan. I think that if you really look at last season as a Ducks fan, really anybody looking at it, there's probably three different ways that you can look at it. The first one is the more pessimistic way of looking at it, right? Ducks do go 13-0, but really they struggle in quite a few, if not all of their big games. Obviously, they struggle with Boise State, but don't forget they also kind of struggled with Idaho. If you want to be pessimistic, got lucky with Ohio State with the kind of end of game clock situation with the 12 men on the field. And really, anybody watching that game has to realize that if the Buckeyes got one more play, the Ducks probably end up losing that game. And then Wisconsin late in the season, they pull out a victory really kind of out of their ass at the end. And then even the Big Ten championship game, it was not in control. Yes, they led for most of the game. They won the fourth quarter, but Penn State had a chance in that as well. So 13-0, it always is going to have a little bit of luck. But if you want to be really pessimistic, you kind of take all the things that they struggled with in the regular season and you put that into the Rose Bowl and you see that it all comes home to roost. All the duck eggs come home to roost at the end. Before we get too far into it, make sure that you like and subscribe, especially if you're a Ducks fan. We're trying to get as many college football videos as we can before the season starts, so make sure that you're along for the ride. That's one way of looking at it. You can also look at it as the Ducks had a great regular season, as they always do, or a lot of the times do, and they never show up at the end of the season. There's maybe 2 or 3 real BCS games that they win. You look at, the Wisconsin Rose Bowl, and you look at the Kansas State Fiesta Bowl. Other than that, I mean, they've won some BCS games. They've won some playoff games. Maybe you include the Florida State game in there as well. But other than that, they've kind of beaten, they beat Liberty. Like, they haven't ended up being the best teams at the end of the season because of a Stanford loss or because of a loss at Arizona or whatever, even if they do end up being a conference champion. That's the second way. And I think that's probably the way that a lot of non-Ducks fans look at 2024 for the Ducks. And then there's the other one that's like, the Ducks had one of the best seasons in school history with the 13-0 conference championship game. I think this is the only 13-0 regular season in history, right? Because the other undefeated season, the first national championship game, they were 12-0. No conference championship. I can't remember exactly. But regardless, one of the 2 undefeated seasons, regular seasons, and conference championship games in school history. First season in the Big Ten. They win. They have the biggest game in Autzen Stadium history with the Ohio State win. They show up. They win that game. That was a game that was like my inner child was... I mean, not even my inner child. I was crying at the end of that game. It was such a big thing. I mean, you could put some USC games in there from, back when USC was the top of the top. I think that they upset USC in like 2007 or something like that. I think it was in 5th grade when they did that. But everything that went into that game, because it's not just an upset of USC or whoever big team comes into the... It was a top 5 matchup that they win, and it catapulted them to the number 1 team in the country and all those other things that go into it. They beat Penn State in the Big Ten championship game in Indianapolis after all this travel, one of the most difficult travel schedules anyone's ever seen in college football with these stupid fucking conferences that we have now. And really, they showed up to every single game, which has not always been the case for Oregon. I mean, oftentimes it's not. There's some game where they don't show up in. Even the games where they struggled, like the Idaho game early in the season, like the Wisconsin game, against teams that they definitely should have put in the ground, they found a way to pull it out in the end. All teams are going to struggle at some point during the season, but they find a way to pull it out in the end. And then you go to the Rose Bowl, and you can look at that as just whatever, they weren't ready. But I mean, Chip Kelly does a Rose Bowl masterclass. If he's going to be an offensive coordinator, he's the best. If he's just going to be an offensive coordinator, he is probably the best. He's got flaws as a head coach, probably has flaws as a coordinator as well, but you could take all that away, and this guy draws up the plays, he's the best. Ohio State definitely had the most talented roster, and probably, again, has the most talented roster in college football. Will Howard showed up to play, and they got hit in the mouth early, and they couldn't do anything about it. That view doesn't make any excuse for what happened in the Rose Bowl, but it does not underestimate or wipe away what actually did go on in that entire season. One game doesn't wipe out 14. It does, you don't win the national championship, but this is Dan Lanning's third season. We forget where the Ducks were just 5 years ago in the depths of, Willie Taggart, or I think what we had, that's the first year for 5 years ago, 6 years ago is the first year for Cristobal. I mean, that's 7-win season. You forget we're 8 years ago, Helfrich. I was living in Eugene. Yeah, I guess it was 2017, so 8 years ago. The Ducks lose 70-3 to Washington State, to Washington. They lose the Civil War at home in those stupid Ducks uniforms. Like, you think about that, and you look at that last season, you say, okay, it is a very successful season. Obviously, there's failure at the end, but it is a very successful season. But what does that mean for 2025? What does that mean for the second year in the Big Ten? Can the Ducks repeat as the Big Ten champions? And can they do something in the playoffs? One of the biggest challenges they're going to have next season is the same challenge that they had last season, which is how many times they're going to have to travel from Eugene to the Midwest, even to the East Coast and back, kind of back to back. And I think that's, although they've had one of not the most difficult schedules in the Big Ten, especially this season as far as the teams they have to play, that is a big challenge that gets talked about a little bit, but I don't think necessarily gets the weight, because there's no stat that people are going to look at. They're not going to look at time travel and be like, oh, these guys, that's a tough schedule. But it truly is. Starting in week 3 when they go to Northwestern, it's Northwestern, then back at home against Oregon State, then out to Penn State, a week off, home against Indiana, then out to Rutgers in New Jersey, then back home against Wisconsin, then to Iowa. That's what? 7 straight weeks where they're home and away. And it's not home and away to Washington or USC. It's home and away to the Midwest or even the East Coast. So that's a really difficult part of the schedule. Made it a little bit easier this year because they have a break in the middle of it. They have their bye week in the middle of that. Where last season it was, 8 straight games where they played either home and away against the Big Ten opponents. So that makes it really tough. They do have the end of the season where they play 2 home games and then at Washington. So it does kind of even out at the end of the season, or not so much even out as much as it makes it a little bit easier. But that's what these fucking stupid Pac-12 schools, and I include Oregon as a stupid fucking Pac-12 school, although their hand was forced because of USC and UCLA, that's what they get for going into these other conferences. I mean, it's only worse for Stanford and Cal, and here's hoping that in the next 5 years, these mega conferences fall apart and we get back to some normalcy. But outside of that, like I mentioned, this schedule, as far as who they play, is one of the more light top-end Big Ten schedules where at Penn State as not the conference opener, but their second conference game, and I mean, how much of a conference game is Northwestern? But that at Penn State game is probably, I mean, the big house last season, the big house in 2006, the LSU game at AT&T Stadium. I mean, this is one of the biggest road games in program history. I mean, maybe some USC games, maybe some Stanford games, but again, it still doesn't feel like a conference game when you go to at Penn State. I think this is the first time that will have ever happened, and definitely the first time it's happened, in my lifetime. I'm almost 30. So that's a huge game, and then they get the week off and have Indiana at home. I probably will find my way to that game because, the second Ducks game I ever went to was 2004 when Indiana came and beat the Ducks by 30 points. This was back in the bloody days, so maybe I'll find myself to that game. Maybe I'll find myself to the Civil War. But those two games there at Penn State, bye week versus Indiana, that is kind of their season. Win one of those two games, especially the Penn State game, and take care of everything else, playoffs for sure. And I think that that is the baseline successful season for the Ducks, is make it to the playoffs. They have to be one of the best 12 teams at the end of the season. And then from there, we'll see. A super successful season, I would say super successful season. Baseline successful where it's like, okay, that's not a panic button from last season, is make the playoffs. Really, the expectations should be to win at least one game in the playoffs. But the question was, can they repeat as Big Ten champions? And, you know, if you want to be in the Big Ten championship game, again, probably the same thing happens. You win one of those two games, especially the Penn State game. You find your way there. If they win the Penn State game, the Indiana game sets up as a much easier game for the Ducks. They're much more favored in that game, I would say, going into it, or at least have much better chance going into it, what we think, than the Penn State game, being that the Penn State game's on the road. Penn State's a better team than Indiana, and there's not the bye week prior to it. But the point stands. Win one of those two games, clean up the rest of the schedule. You find yourself in the Big Ten championship game. Maybe we get the Oregon-Ohio State. Maybe it's a rematch of last season, although Penn State has a real tough schedule, so I'm not expecting them to be in there. Or maybe we have one of these other teams, Illinois, Indiana, whoever it is, show up in there. I don't necessarily think that's the most important thing. I think that winning the Big Ten championship game in the first season was very important for the program. I think it was very important for Dan Lanning establishing himself, as this Ducks coach for the long run that's going to take this program to new heights. But I don't think that's as important this season as long as they make the playoffs. And I know there was a lot of talk about not winning it last season for the seeding, and I think that definitely, if you want to take the third view that I had in the beginning, where that playoff game just was tough, it was a real tough matchup, you really got to look at the seeding as part of that. Having to play Ohio State after they've already got a game in really sucks as the number one undefeated team in the country. I think that that definitely got the worst draw of any of the conference champions, and probably arguably of any of the teams in the playoffs last season. So the straight seeding model that they just announced today or yesterday, when you're seeing this, if you see it the day it comes out, should make it more advantageous to win. But again, I don't think that the bye is necessarily something that you're going to want, especially if you don't have to play in the conference championship game. I think there's still an advantage to not playing in the conference championship game and then getting the bye, essentially the bye going into the playoff, as opposed to the bye in the first round of the playoff. You know what I'm saying? So I think they can win the Big Ten championship game. I don't think that it is as important this year to win it. Now, the second question on top of that is, Big Ten championship win, great. Making the playoffs, great. Can they win 3 or 4 games in the playoffs, or even one game in the playoffs, based off of what we saw last season? And that takes us more into the players and the X's and O's and what goes into winning a playoff game. And I think that one of the biggest questions going into the season, probably the biggest question going into the season, is Dante Moore replacing Dillon Gabriel. And Dillon Gabriel definitely goes into that third view that I talked about, where if you want to look at it as one of the most successful seasons, which it honestly is, I think that there's definitely a good bit of the third part of it, but there's definitely some of the first part of it where the Ducks, their errors showed up in the playoffs. But if you want to look at that third part of it, you have to take into account a quarterback that transferred in and spent one season in the program, was the third place in the Heisman voting, was a Heisman finalist. That's only the third Heisman finalist in school history. Like, all these things are, maybe fourth. I don't know if Bo Nix was a Heisman finalist as well. But all these things go into how great of a season it was. But again, to make it better, they have to win in the playoffs this season. And can Dante Moore step in for Dillon Gabriel? I think that he can. Now, I do think that there are more growing pains to expect from Dante Moore than Dillon Gabriel. Obviously, Dillon Gabriel, was on his 6th college football season as a starter. This will be Dante Moore's, technically second, but he didn't start for the whole season with UCLA at a different school. But the advantages that Dante Moore has is he's probably a more all-around physical. He definitely a better physical talent. Maybe has a better arm. And, Dillon Gabriel is doing a lot with not as much as most quarterbacks have. Some people have that as a downside for Dillon Gabriel. I think that makes him what made him one of the great college football quarterbacks of all time. If you really look at the stats, I know the number of years and all this kind of stuff, but what he did consistently in 3 different schools is because he knows who he is and how to fucking play football. Now, Dante Moore has a lot more to work with, but can he step in and do what he needs to do? He can make the throws in the intermediate and in the middle of the field that maybe Dillon Gabriel can't make because he's a smaller quarterback, because he's, having to deal with pressure in his face or whatever. He can't necessarily make those throws. We saw Dante Moore make those throws at UCLA. Now, obviously, there's a lot more mistakes to go along with it. A freshman quarterback on a bad team is going to do those things. But Dante Moore has spent a season in the program. He sat behind Dillon Gabriel. He learned from him. He's in a quarterback competition. Like it's one of those things that is going to create talent. It's going to pull out the talent that he has. Will he answer the bell? That is one of the big questions. We'll find that out early on in the season. Montana State should give him a good chance to kind of get into it, but Oklahoma State, although they were bad last season, has been a pretty good program. They are generally flirting with a top 25 status, so it might not be a top 25 game, but that's not going to be an easy game, and I think that's where Dante Moore will learn a lot. I think that the game at Northwestern is really good to get on the road in the Big Ten against probably the worst team in the Big Ten or one of the worst teams in the Big Ten to kind of get that experience is good. And we'll set him up. He has a real good kind of building up to that Penn State game. Now, do I expect Dante Moore to win the Penn State game? No. I think that they're going to have to rely on their defense, which should, again, be very good. It was one of the best defenses in the country last season. I think they should, again, be very good. And I think that if the offensive line, which I would say is the second biggest question, can mesh and get things going by that time, the run game should again be very good, and that should help Dante Moore in those 2 big games, Penn State and Indiana. But what I think is that some of the growing pains that Dillon Gabriel had and the team had with Dillon Gabriel at the beginning of last season need to be learned from, because some of those same things were problems in the Rose Bowl, and that was just the absolute need by any Oregon offensive coordinator going back to Chip Kelly under Mike Bellotti to run side-to-side plays and just think that because the Ducks are known to be fast, they're going to be faster than every team in the country. And that shit works when you're playing Montana State or when you're playing, Arizona or when you're playing Rutgers. Yeah, because 5-star recruits are faster than 3-star recruits. That's why they're 5-star recruits. Doesn't necessarily mean they're better football players, but they have more potential because they are bigger, faster people. And if you get them the ball, they're going to beat those guys. But when you're playing 5-stars against 5-stars, you're playing the best against the best, you have to have a game plan. And they didn't have that on offense or defense in the Rose Bowl. And if they kind of pulled the same fucking tricks where they think they're just going to get pressure on the quarterback and because they're bigger and stronger, and then they're going to be able to run past people from side-to-side plays instead of setting plays up, throwing intermediate passes, they're going to lose in the playoffs again. So I think that Dante Moore offers some of the things that they were unable to do last season, which is those intermediate passes to Sadiq, who I have on my jersey right now. Sadiq has to be a big part if they're going to win these big games. Sadiq has to be a big part of it because he's the dude that can go get the ball at 10 yards and make it a 15-yard gain. Or he could just make that catch, right? Evan Stewart obviously can beat people down the field. DeCorian Moore looks like he is a pretty similar Justin Jefferson kind of player where he as a route runner and can catch contested catches, but he's also small. So it has to go through Sadiq. It has to be the between the tackles run game to really establish something and not just stink and dunk side-to-side stuff that loses 3 yards on first down. You're 2nd and 13, you can't get anything going. If they can do that, if they can establish that throughout the season, even if they have a worse regular season, which I'm expecting there to be at least one loss this regular season, I think that there's definitely a world where they go 13-0 again, they're number one seed again. But I kind of hope there's a loss in there somewhere. I kind of hope it's a close loss. They have to struggle with it. But they have to try new things. They have to establish new things. And not just because they can beat Wisconsin with the dink and dunk side-to-side stuff. That's how they play Wisconsin. They need to try things that will work against Ohio State, will work against Texas, will work against Georgia. Because that is where the road runs through. That is where it ends up. It doesn't run through Wisconsin in Eugene, October 25th. It doesn't run through Iowa, November 8th. It runs through the Rose Bowl, the Fiesta Bowl, the Cotton Bowl. It runs through all those teams that are going to be there. I think the national championship game's in Houston this year. It runs through that. And that's what they have to be preparing for throughout the season. And if they can get Dante Moore there, they have the talent around him. They will have the talent every single year to do it because that's the kind of program they are at this point. But if the coaches understand what the main goal is, it's not 13-0. It's not a Big Ten championship game. It's a national championship. And the whole season has to be geared towards that. Then they can do something special in 2025. Thanks for watching that video. Make sure that you like and subscribe. And if you made it this far, leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Do you think the Ducks can do something special in 2025? Is a Big Ten championship another successful season? Or do they have to win at least 1 or 2 games in the playoff to prove that they belong at the blue chip level in college football? If you want to watch more of my videos, I do have those for you. Over here, I've got my video about Texas Tech. It's a similar video to this where I talk about Texas Tech can make the playoffs. Up here, I've got my perfect Power 5 conference realignment, more of a conceptual video. Check that out if you like those. Other than that, I've got my subscribe link on this side, and we will check you next time. See ya!